sentenced to die for an apple. The 7-year-old girl who defied the hangman. They built the gallows before they rang the church bell. Not behind the jail, not out by the river where men settled scores and left their sins for the tide. Right in the square, where the market stalls still smelled of peaches and salt pork, where the courthouse steps were worn smooth by boots and prayers. The carpenters worked fast, eyes down, as if looking at the wood too long might make them answer for it. By mid-morning, the scaffold stood like a new kind of tree, square-shouldered and ugly, with fresh rope hanging where no rope belonged. And beneath it, in a dress that had once been a flour sack, a child no taller than the judge's desk was made to stand still. Her name was Junie, 7 years old. Her wrists were bound with cord that bit into her skin, and the town pretended not to notice, because noticing would have made them human. A sheriff's deputy held her by the shoulder, steadying her the way you might steady a sack of grain. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the hangman. The hangman's name was Silas Crow, and he had a face built from old decisions. His hands were careful hands, the kind that could tie a knot the same way every time. He'd been hired for this job the way you hired a man to fix your roof. Quietly, efficiently, with payment pressed into his palm so nobody had to say what they were paying him for. Silas stepped forward, rope looped over his arm, and the murmur in the square tightened into something mean and expectant. The sheriff read the charge again, as if repeating it would make it make sense. "Larceny," he said. "Theft of property. Incitement." A woman in the crowd hissed, "For an apple." Like the word apple was an insult. Someone laughed. Someone else prayed. The preacher kept his mouth shut, which was its own kind of sermon. Junie didn't cry. That, more than the gallows, made the square feel wrong. Silas lowered the rope in slow, practiced motions. He had done this before, never to a child, not like this, not to someone whose hair still held the soft curl of babyhood. But the rope didn't care who it touched. Rope was honest that way. Junie lifted her chin as he approached, and her eyes fixed on his like nails driven into wood. "Sir," she said, voice small but clear, "you got to listen." Silas paused. He shouldn't have. The sheriff shifted, annoyed. Junie kept speaking before anyone could stop her. "I didn't steal it," she said. "I took it." The crowd made a sound, half laughter, half anger, the sound people make when a child tells the truth in a way that threatens their rules. Junie swallowed once, like she was steadying herself for something bigger than a rope. "It was hollow," she said. "The apple was hollow." Silas felt his spine go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air. Junie's gaze didn't move. "And the wax was red," she whispered. "Same red as the judge's seal." Behind her, on the courthouse steps, Judge Orville Caldwell's face changed so fast it almost didn't change at all. Almost. Silas saw it anyway. Junie turned her head just enough to point her chin toward the crowd, toward a man standing half hidden near the far edge of the square by a cart stacked with barrels. "You!" she called, and her voice cracked the way a bell cracks when it's struck too hard. "Mr. Finch, tell Miss Clarissa. Tell her I didn't eat it. Tell her I kept the core." The name Finch rippled like a thrown stone. A few heads turned, a few faces tightened. Judge Caldwell didn't move, but his hands curled against his robe, as if he wanted to tear the cloth off his own body. The sheriff barked, "Silence!" Junie didn't flinch. She looked back at Silas. Her voice dropped lower, meant only for him. "Don't be the one," she said. "Don't be the one to do what they want." Silas Crow had heard pleas before. He'd heard men swear innocence. He'd heard women beg. He'd heard prayers. Some real, some performative, all useless once the law decided you were already dead. But he had never heard a child speak like she understood something grown folks refused to say out loud. He opened his mouth, not sure what he meant to do, and then Junie did the one thing no one expected from a child sentenced to die for an apple. She smiled. Not sweetly, not bravely, like she knew something they didn't. The rope in Silas's hand suddenly felt heavier than any weight he'd ever carried. He leaned in because he couldn't stop himself, and Junie whispered again, the words slipping between them like a blade. "The core is in your pocket," she said. "They put it there." Silas froze. His pocket? He hadn't touched her. He hadn't taken anything from her. He hadn't. A shout snapped through the square. The sheriff strode forward, impatient, and in that moment, Silas's hand moved without permission from his mind. He slid his fingers into his coat pocket and felt something round, something firm, something with a waxy edge. His breath caught so sharply it hurt. Junie watched him, calm as a stone. Silas pulled his hand out. He didn't show what he'd found. He just looked at the sheriff, and for the first time all morning, his voice came out rough. "I need a minute," he said. The sheriff blinked, like he hadn't heard. "Do your job." Silas stared past him, up at Judge Caldwell. The judge's gaze was fixed on Silas's pocket like it was a wound. Silas understood then. Without proof, without explanation, in the simple, terrifying way you understand a trap the moment you step into it. This wasn't about an apple. The apple was just the excuse. Junie was the message, and the message was meant for someone else. Silas turned back to the child, and she said, quiet, almost gentle, "You can still choose." The square waited. The rope swayed, innocent and patient. Silas Crow tightened his grip. And then he did something that made the entire town suck in breath like one body. He stepped back from Junie. He raised his hand. And he said, loud enough for the sheriff, the judge, the preacher, and every watching soul to hear, "This sentence ain't lawful." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Even the birds seemed to pause in the trees. Then the sheriff exploded. "What did you say?" Silas didn't look away. His voice steadied, not because he was brave, but because fear had finally burned down to something clean. "I said," he repeated, "you can hang a thief. You can hang a man. You can hang a woman if you're wicked enough. But you can't hang a child over fruit and call it justice." Judge Caldwell's face hardened into something marble. "Proceed," he said, quiet as poison. Silas didn't. Junie's smile faded and she blinked once. Slow, like she was making sure she would remember this moment, no matter what happened next. The sheriff stepped toward Silas, hand reaching for his pistol, and that was when Junie screamed, not in fear, in warning. "He got the core!" she shouted, pointing at Silas's pocket. "He got the red wax core!" Every head snapped toward Silas. Even the people who didn't understand what she meant understood what she'd done. She'd made the secret public. Silas's hand shot to his pocket, not to hide it, but to keep it from being taken. The sheriff lunged. Silas pivoted. The crowd surged, not forward like a mob, but sideways, bodies colliding, voices rising, panic spreading the way fire spreads when you knock over a lamp. And in the chaos, Junie moved, 7 years old, wrists bound, feet bare. She did the one thing a condemned child wasn't supposed to do. She ran. A deputy grabbed for her and missed, fingers scraping cloth. Junie darted under an elbow, slipped between two skirts, ducked behind a barrel. Someone shouted her name, maybe to help, maybe to stop her, maybe just because the sound of it made them feel less guilty. Silas saw her disappear into the crowd like a fish into dark water. He turned, just long enough to see Judge Caldwell descending the courthouse steps with a speed that didn't fit his age. The judge's eyes weren't on Junie. They were on Silas, on the pocket, on the core. Silas didn't hesitate. He shoved through the crowd, shoulder checking a man who tried to block him, and sprinted toward the narrow alley between the apothecary and the milliner's shop. Behind him, the sheriff's voice cut like a whip. "Stop him! Stop him!" Silas ran anyway, because now he knew. The child hadn't defied him. She'd recruited him. And if he stopped running, Junie would die, whether the rope touched her or not. 3 days earlier, Junie had been carrying laundry through the big house, humming under her breath the way her mama did when her hands were busy and her mind needed somewhere else to go. The Porterfield plantation sat just outside Beaufort, close enough to smell the river, when the wind shifted. The main house was white and wide and proud, with columns that made it look like it was always posing for someone important. Junie lived behind it in a narrow cabin with her mother, Hester, who worked as a seamstress and mender. Hester's fingers were always moving, always fixing what other people tore. Junie had learned early that the world broke things and women like her mama were expected to put them back together without complaint. That morning, Mrs. Evelyn Porterfield, the mistress, had been in a temper. Not the loud kind that threw dishes, but the tight, controlled kind that made the entire house hold its breath. A letter had arrived. Junie didn't know what the letter said. She couldn't read. But she'd watched Mrs. Porterfield's face as she held it, and the mistress's mouth had gone thin. Then Mrs. Porterfield had walked to the window, stared out at the yard, where Junie's mama hung sheets on a line, and whispered something Junie couldn't hear. After that, everything shifted. The cook was told to bake extra bread for town visitors. The stable boy was sent to polish the carriage until it shone. And Hester was ordered upstairs, needle and thread in hand, to mend a tear in one of Mrs. Porterfield's dresses, the pale yellow one she wore when she wanted to look like sunshine instead of storm. Junie followed her mama, carrying the sewing basket. In the upstairs sitting room, the mistress sat stiff-backed while Hester worked. Mrs. Porterfield didn't look at Hester, but she watched Junie with a strange intensity, like Junie was a stain she couldn't wash out. "Where did you get that song?" Mrs. Porterfield asked suddenly. Junie froze mid-hum. Hester's needle paused. "The one you're humming," Mrs. Porterfield said. "That little tune." Junie glanced at her mama, unsure. Hester's eyes flicked, warning. Junie lowered her voice. "My mama," she said. Mrs. Porterfield's fingers tightened on her teacup. "No, that tune, I heard it before." Hester's voice came out soft, controlled. "It's just a tune, ma'am." Mrs. Porterfield stared at Hester then, truly stared, and something unspoken flickered between them. History, resentment, fear. Junie didn't understand it, but she felt it in her bones. Mrs. Porterfield leaned forward slightly. "Hester," she said, like the name tasted complicated, "if you had the chance to change what you are, would you take it?" Hester didn't answer. Her needle moved again, a tiny flash of silver. Mrs. Porterfield exhaled, sharp. "Of course you'd say no," she muttered, but her tone sounded like she was arguing with herself, not Hester. Then the front door banged downstairs. A male voice, familiar, authoritative, called out, "Mrs. Porterfield!" Sheriff Alden Price entered the house like he owned it, hat in hand, boots leaving faint mud on the polished floor. He smiled, and the smile didn't reach his eyes. He was not the master. Mr. Porterfield was away on business, which meant the sheriff's presence felt even more like intrusion. Mrs. Porterfield stood. "Sheriff," he bowed his head slightly, pretending respect. "Ma'am, Judge Caldwell's request. We need your carriage this afternoon." Mrs. Porterfield's jaw clenched. "For what purpose?" Sheriff Price's eyes flicked toward Hester and Junie, then back. "Court business." Hester kept sewing. Her shoulders tightened. Junie felt something in the room sharpen, like the air had turned into a thin wire. Mrs. Porterfield forced a smile. "If the judge requests it, of course." Sheriff Price stepped closer, lowering his voice. "He also requests discretion." Mrs. Porterfield's smile broke. "Discretion," she repeated, like the word was filthy. Sheriff Price's gaze slid to Junie, lingering too long. "And obedience." Hester's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A bead of blood bloomed. Junie watched it, heart racing. Blood in a white dress was dangerous. Mistakes in the big house were punished in ways Junie didn't have language for, only fear. But Mrs. Porterfield didn't look at the blood. She looked at Hester's face, then at Junie. And then, so softly Junie almost missed it, Mrs. Porterfield said, "Keep her close." Hester stiffened. Sheriff Price smiled again. "Don't worry, ma'am, we'll keep everyone close." He tipped his hat and left. When the door shut, Mrs. Porterfield sagged a fraction, like the room had finally allowed her to breathe. Hester finished the stitch with trembling hands. Junie whispered, "Mama? What's wrong?" Hester didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the window, on the yard outside, on the road leading toward town, like it was the mouth of something hungry. Finally, Hester leaned down, close to Junie's ear. "Today," she murmured, "you don't go nowhere alone." Junie nodded quickly. She wanted to be brave. She didn't even know what brave was supposed to look like, but she knew it wasn't crying. That afternoon, Hester kept Junie beside her in the sewing room behind the kitchen. Junie played with scraps of fabric, making tiny dolls with no faces, because faces made them too real. Near sundown, a wagon rolled into the yard. A man jumped down, thin, pale, with ink stains on his fingers and a satchel slung over his shoulder. He didn't look like a farmer. He looked like someone who belonged to words. Junie watched from behind the window frame. He spoke with Mrs. Porterfield on the porch. Their voices were low, urgent. Junie caught only fragments. "Judge Caldwell," the man said. "Too late," Mrs. Porterfield hissed. "The shipment—" He pressed. Mrs. Porterfield's voice cracked. "You promised me nobody would be hurt." The man's shoulders tightened. "That was before they found out." Junie's heartbeat thumped. Mrs. Porterfield glanced toward the kitchen as if she could sense eyes watching. And then, like she was making a choice she despised, she nodded once. The man handed her something small, a bundle wrapped in cloth. Mrs. Porterfield hid it inside her sleeve. Then she turned sharply and called, "Hester!" Hester appeared at the porch doorway, face carefully blank. Mrs. Porterfield stepped close, too close, and spoke in a voice meant to sound casual. "Take Junie into town tomorrow," she said. "Buy apples." Hester's eyes flicked up, sharp, questioning. Mrs. Porterfield's lips tightened. "The green ones. From the cart by the courthouse. Understand?" Hester didn't respond out loud. Her fingers curled around Junie's shoulder. Mrs. Porterfield's gaze hardened. "Do it," she repeated, "or you'll lose her." Junie didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Threat dressed as instruction. That night, Hester didn't sing while she worked. She sat on the edge of their narrow bed and held Junie's hands in hers. "Junie," she said, voice low, "if anything happens tomorrow, you do what I say. You hear me?" Junie nodded, eyes wide. Hester swallowed hard. "You don't tell nobody nothing. Even if they scare you. Even if they yell. Even if they say they'll—" She stopped herself, breath shuddering. Junie whispered, "Mama, why we gotta buy apples?" Hester looked at her for a long moment, and Junie saw something raw behind her mother's eyes. Fear, but also anger. And something else that felt like a door cracking open. "Because," Hester said softly, "some folks hide poison in pretty things." Junie frowned. "Poison?" Hester shook her head quickly. "Not real poison," she whispered. "Not like that. I mean trouble. Trouble they want to feed to somebody else so they don't have to swallow it themselves." Junie didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway. She trusted her mama the way you trust the ground under your feet. That was the last calm night they had. The next day in town, the square was busy with the kind of activity that made Junie feel small. Men argued over prices. Women moved in tight clusters. A pair of deputies stood near the courthouse, eyes scanning like hawks. Hester kept Junie's hand in a grip that hurt. They approached the apple cart as instructed. Green apples stacked in neat pyramids that gleamed like they'd been polished. The man behind the cart smiled too wide. "Morning." Hester didn't smile back. "Apples," she said, voice flat. He reached down and picked one up. As he did, his thumb pressed hard against the side, as if checking something. His eyes flicked to Junie, then away. He set the apple in Hester's palm. Junie saw it then. Something faintly different about the fruit. A slight seam near the core, too smooth, too deliberate. Hester's fingers twitched. She took it like it burned. "Just one?" the man asked, too casual. Hester forced herself to nod. "Just one." The man leaned forward slightly. "Tell her," he murmured, eyes on Junie, "don't eat the core." Hester's face went rigid. Junie stared, confused. Before Hester could respond, a shadow fell across them. Sheriff Price stepped up beside the cart, smiling like a man arriving at a party he'd planned. "Well, now," he drawled, "what do we have here?" Hester's grip tightened painfully around Junie's hand. Sheriff Price's eyes locked on the apple in Hester's palm. "I heard there was theft," he said, voice loud enough to draw attention. "Apples disappearing from honest men's carts." The apple seller's smile vanished. He lifted his hand slightly like he was surrendering. Sheriff Price didn't look at him. He looked at Hester, then at Junie. Junie felt the sheriff's gaze crawl over her like ants. "Little girl," Sheriff Price said, "did you take an apple?" Junie opened her mouth to say no. Hester cut in quickly. "We paid," she said. "Ask him." Sheriff Price smiled wider. "I'm not asking you, Hester." The way he said her name made Junie's stomach twist. Hester's face stayed still, but her eyes flashed. Sheriff Price crouched down, bringing his face level with Junie's. "You know what happens to thieves?" he asked softly. Junie's throat tightened. She shook her head. Sheriff Price's smile stayed, but his eyes sharpened. "They get punished," he whispered. "And sometimes the punishment teaches everybody else a lesson." Junie's eyes stung. She tried not to cry. Hester's hand trembled, and Junie felt her mother preparing to pull her away. Sheriff Price rose suddenly and barked, "Search them!" 2 deputies moved in. Hester jerked back. "No!" she snapped, voice breaking composure. The deputies grabbed Hester's arms. Another reached toward Junie. Junie screamed. The apple fell. It hit the ground with a dull thud and rolled. Sheriff Price stepped forward, picked it up, and held it like a trophy. "Well," he said brightly, "look at that." He turned it in his fingers. Junie saw him press his thumb against the side, hard, knowing. He glanced toward the courthouse steps, where Judge Caldwell stood watching, expression unreadable. Sheriff Price raised his voice. "Caught red-handed." Hester's eyes widened. "That's a lie," she said, voice fierce now. A deputy struck her words away with a shove, and Hester stumbled. Junie tried to run to her. Hands grabbed Junie's shoulders. Junie clawed, kicked, wriggled. Childish fury, raw panic. Sheriff Price leaned close to Junie and murmured, so only she could hear. "You should have eaten it," he said. "Would have made this easier." Junie didn't understand, but terror flooded her anyway. They dragged Hester and Junie toward the courthouse like they were sacks of stolen goods. And by the time the bell rang that afternoon, the town had its story. A little slave girl had stolen an apple, and the law was going to make sure no one forgot what happened to thieves. But that story was a lie built around a truth too ugly to say, because Junie hadn't stolen the apple. The apple had been placed in her hand like a loaded weapon, and someone powerful wanted it back. The trial lasted less time than it took the cook at Porterfield to bake cornbread. Junie sat on a bench that felt too high, her feet dangling, her wrists tied, staring at the judge's polished shoes, because looking at faces made her want to scream. Judge Caldwell didn't look at her like she was a child. He looked at her like she was evidence. Sheriff Price spoke first, loudly, confidently, as if he were reciting a sermon. "Larceny," he declared. "Theft of property." Then he added the word that made the room shift. "Incitement." A murmur ran through the spectators. Incitement meant something different in 1850 than it did in any child's mind. It meant fear. It meant uprisings whispered about in kitchens and stables. It meant white folks clinging harder to their power because they could feel the world changing at the edges. A man with ink-stained fingers, Mr. Finch, stood near the back, face pale, jaw clenched, eyes flicking toward Junie like he wanted to reach her, but knew he couldn't. Junie caught his gaze for a heartbeat. His eyes said, "I'm sorry." Junie didn't understand why she needed apology from a stranger. Then Mrs. Porterfield entered. She wore her pale yellow dress, mended perfectly, as if the world wasn't unraveling. She took a seat near the front. She didn't look at Junie. She didn't look at Hester, who stood to the side, wrists bound, eyes blazing. Mrs. Porterfield stared straight ahead, hands folded, posture immaculate. Junie realized, with a chill that felt too old for her bones, that the mistress wasn't here to save them. She was here to watch. Judge Caldwell called a witness, the apple seller who now claimed Junie had snatched the fruit and tried to run. Hester spoke up, voice shaking with rage. "He lying. Sheriff told him what to say." Judge Caldwell's gavel struck. "Silence." Hester's eyes flashed. "This ain't about no apple," she snapped. "You know it ain't." The room went still. Sheriff Price's smile faltered, just slightly. Judge Caldwell leaned forward. His voice turned soft, dangerous. "Hester," he said, "you will not speak unless spoken to." Hester lifted her chin. "Then speak to me," she said, fierce. "Look me in the face and tell me you're going to kill a baby for fruit." Junie's heart pounded. She stared at the judge now, searching his face for something human. Judge Caldwell looked at Hester like she was a nuisance. Then he looked at Junie. And his eyes flickered. Just once. Like something in him recognized something in her. Junie felt it like a hand around her throat. The judge's mouth tightened. He turned to Sheriff Price. "Where is the apple, say?" he asked. Sheriff Price held it up. From her bench, Junie could see it clearly. The seam, the too smooth patch, the faint smear of red wax she hadn't noticed before. Junie's stomach flipped. Judge Caldwell's gaze locked on it. His voice remained calm. "Cut it." The apple seller hesitated. "Judge!" "Cut it," Caldwell repeated. A knife appeared. The apple was sliced down the middle. The room leaned in. Junie leaned forward too, like her body knew this was the heart of everything. The blade parted fruit, and inside where seeds should have been was a hollow. A neatly carved pocket, empty. The room erupted with murmurs. Sheriff Price's smile returned, sharp. He turned toward Junie like a performer revealing the trick. "Well now," he said loudly, "would you look at that? A thief and a courier." Junie frowned, confused. "Courier?" Judge Caldwell's gaze snapped to Junie, cutting. "Where is it?" he asked, voice too quiet. Junie shook her head, frightened. I don't know," she whispered. Sheriff Price stepped forward. "She knows," he said smoothly. "They always know," Hester surged. "Leave her be." A deputy restrained her. Junie's eyes filled with tears she didn't want. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, and his voice softened in a way that felt like a trap. "Child," he said, "tell me who gave you that apple." Junie looked at her mama. Hester's eyes begged her, "Don't." Junie looked at Mrs. Porterfield. The mistress stared straight ahead, face pale, hands clenched. Junie's throat closed. She looked back at the judge. In that moment, Junie understood something without words. The judge wanted her to name someone. And if she did, someone else would die. If she didn't, she would. Junie didn't know what was inside the apple. She didn't know what incitement meant. She didn't know why grown folks were shaking like leaves over a piece of fruit, but she knew what choosing felt like, and she knew her mama's eyes. Junie swallowed and whispered, "Nobody." The judge's face hardened. Sheriff Price shrugged theatrically. "Then she chooses the rope," he said. The room went silent. A death sentence wasn't common for theft, not even in a cruel world. But this wasn't a normal court. It was theater with a noose. Judge Caldwell lifted his gavel. His voice rang like iron. "By the authority of this court," he declared, "you are sentenced to death." Junie's breath vanished. Hester screamed. Not words, sound. Mrs. Porterfield flinched. Mr. Finch clenched his fists so hard his knuckles went white. Junie stared at the judge, trying to understand how a man could say death to a child and still wear a robe like holiness. Judge Caldwell's eyes flickered again. Recognition. Conflict. Something quickly buried. Then he struck the gavel, and it was done. Junie was let out, feet dragging, mind blank with shock. As they passed the door, she heard Sheriff Price murmur to the deputy beside him, "Make sure the hangman checks his pocket." Junie didn't understand then. She would. Silas Crow had been hired the same day the gallows were built. Sheriff Price came to him with money and a job, the way men came to Silas when they wanted something done, without asking too many questions. "Court sentence," the sheriff had said. "Quick." Silas had asked, "Who?" The sheriff's smile had stretched. "A thief." Silas had nodded, because that's what you did when you were paid to be a tool. But the night before the execution, Silas sat alone in his rented room and stared at his hands. He wasn't a monster. Monsters enjoyed what they did. Silas was something worse. A man who told himself he was just doing what the law demanded. He'd learned to stop thinking about faces, to stop wondering who deserved what, to stop asking why some people got trials that lasted days and some people got trials that lasted minutes. He'd learned to tie knots, to keep his breathing steady, to treat death like carpentry. But a child, that didn't fit the stories he told himself so he could sleep. On the morning of the execution, as he walked toward the square, he saw the crowd gathering, hungry and afraid. He saw women clutching their children's hands. He saw men pretending they were there for justice, not entertainment. He saw Judge Caldwell standing on the courthouse steps, posture stiff, eyes hard. He saw Sheriff Price laughing with a deputy like it was a fair day. And he saw Junie, small, bound, quiet. Silas's chest tightened with something he tried to ignore. Then Junie spoke to him, spoke like she understood the game. And when she whispered, "The core is in your pocket," Silas's life cracked open. Because it was true. Because he felt it. Because that meant the sheriff had planted the evidence on him. And if the sheriff had planted evidence on him, then Silas wasn't the executioner. He was the next victim. The next. Silas ran into the alley, boots pounding, breath ripping through him. Behind him, the crowd roared. He shoved past a stack of crates, rounded the corner, and nearly collided with a man stepping out of a doorway. Ink-stained fingers, pale face, sharp eyes. Mr. Finch. Silas grabbed his coat and slammed him against the wall. "What is this?" Silas snarled. "What did you put in my pocket?" Finch's eyes widened, then narrowed. "You have it," he hissed. Silas pulled the apple core from his pocket, half a fruit, hollowed and plugged with red wax. Finch's breath caught like he'd been punched. "Oh, God," Finch whispered. "They're really doing it." Silas's voice dropped. "Doing what?" Finch stared at the core like it was a heart. "Hiding truth," he said, voice shaking. "Burying names. Killing children to keep men like Caldwell clean." Silas's spine went cold. "Names?" Finch swallowed hard. "Judge Caldwell," he said, "and Sheriff Price, they've been selling people. Not just slaves, Crow. Free black men. Children taken off docks. Women grabbed off roads. Folks who belong to nobody powerful. They put false papers on them and shipped them south. Deeper, where nobody asks questions." Silas's stomach twisted. Finch continued, words tumbling now. "I found proof. Letters. Signatures. A seal. I was going to send it north. Mrs. Caldwell, Clarissa, she helped. She hid the paper in an apple, sealed it with wax from the judge's own desk, because she thought nobody would think to search fruit." Silas stared. "Why involve a child?" Finch's eyes burned. "We didn't," he whispered. "Mrs. Porterfield, Evelyn, she panicked. She thought using a slave child would keep suspicion away from her." Silas's jaw clenched. "So you let the child take the blame?" Finch flinched. "No," he said quickly. "No, we tried to get it back. But the sheriff, he intercepted her before she left the cart. He knew what to look for. He knew about the wax seal. He had to. Silas's mind raced. Junie's words echoed. Don't be the one. She wasn't just scared. She was protecting someone or something. Silas shoved the core toward Finch. Open it, he barked. Finch's hands trembled as he scraped at the red wax with a fingernail. The wax peeled back. Inside the hollow apple core was a tiny roll of paper, thin and tightly wound. Finch pulled it free carefully, like it might explode. Silas leaned in. The paper was covered in ink, names, dates, initials. At the bottom, a pressed red seal. Judge Caldwell's seal. Finch's eyes filled. This is it, he whispered. This is the proof. Silas stared at the names, unable to read them fully, but able to understand the weight. This is why they're hanging her, he said hoarsely. Finch nodded, face twisted with guilt. They think she still has it, he whispered, or they want her dead so nobody asks why a child was sentenced in the first place. Silas looked back toward the square, where the roar still surged. Where is she? He demanded. Finch swallowed. If she ran like you said, she'll head to the docks, he said quickly. That's where she goes with her mother sometimes. There's a man there, Ezekiel, who... A gunshot cracked in the distance. Finch flinched. Silas's heart slammed. They're hunting her, Silas snapped. He grabbed Finch by the sleeve. You're coming, he said. You're going to put this paper where it belongs, and you're going to help me get that child out. Finch hesitated. They'll kill... Silas's eyes burned. They already decided to, he growled. You want her blood on your ink-stained hands? Move! Finch moved. They sprinted toward the docks. Junie didn't know where she was running. She just knew she couldn't stop. She darted through legs and skirts, heart hammering like it was trying to escape her ribs. She smelled sweat, smoke, horse dung, and fear. Someone grabbed at her again. She twisted free, surprising herself with how strong panic made her. She bolted down a side street toward the river, because the river was the only place in town that felt like it had space to breathe. She reached the docks, where boats bobbed and men shouted and crates thudded. Junie hid behind a stack of nets, pressing her back against wood, lungs burning. Her wrists were still bound. Her hands hurt. Her throat hurt from not crying. She swallowed hard, trying to remember what her mama told her. Don't tell nobody nothing. But Junie's mind kept snagging on one thought, sharp as a needle. Mama. Where was Mama? Had they hurt her? Junie's eyes stung. She forced herself to blink the tears away, because crying made you weak, and weak got you caught. Footsteps pounded on the planks. Junie held her breath. 2 deputies ran past, scanning, shouting her name like it was a curse. Junie! Girl! Come out! Junie stayed still, tiny body pressed into shadow. The deputies moved on. Junie exhaled slowly. Then she heard a different sound. Someone humming. A low, steady tune. The same tune Junie had been humming in the big house. Her head snapped. An older man stood near a moored boat, coiling rope in slow motions. His skin was dark, his shoulders broad, his face lined with the kind of age that came from surviving too much. He hummed like he didn't care who heard. Junie's eyes widened. Ezekiel. He worked on the docks. He'd once given Junie a piece of dried molasses candy and told her not to tell nobody, as if secrets were the currency of survival. Junie rose slightly from behind the nets, heart pounding. Ezekiel's humming didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward her, sharp. He didn't stop humming. He just shifted his rope coil, opening a gap behind him, like he was making room without announcing it. Junie understood. She crept from hiding, feet silent on the planks, slipping toward him. Ezekiel kept humming. Junie reached his side. He didn't look down at her. He murmured, without moving his lips much. What you doing out here, little bird? Junie swallowed. They gonna hang me, she whispered, voice cracking. Ezekiel's humming faltered. Just a breath. Then resumed. Not if we got breath, he said softly. Who sent you? Junie hesitated. Miss Porterfield, she whispered. Then, because truth bubbled up even when fear tried to crush it, she added, but she ain't saved me. She watched. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. Junie's eyes filled despite herself. I didn't steal it, she whispered. It was hollow. It had wax. Ezekiel's hand stopped coiling rope. For the first time, he looked directly at Junie. And Junie saw something in his eyes that made her shiver. Recognition. Not of her face. Of the situation. "Lord," Ezekiel murmured. "They used you." Junie's breath hitched. "Mama?" she whispered. Ezekiel's gaze darkened. "Your mama got took back to the courthouse," he said, voice low. "Sheriff got her locked. He thinks she know where the paper is." Junie's stomach dropped. Paper. So it was paper. Junie swallowed, mind racing. She remembered the apple seller saying, "Don't eat the core." She remembered the seam. She remembered the judge's eyes. Junie whispered, "I kept it." Ezekiel's eyes widened. "Where?" Junie shook her head, confused, then realized she had kept the core, but not like they thought. She hadn't swallowed it. She'd hidden it, not in a ledger, not in a drawer, not in some grand place. In the one place nobody searched on a child because they didn't see her as human enough to have privacy. Junie lifted her bound hands and pointed with her chin at the ragged pouch tied around her waist. A small cloth pocket her mama had sewn into her dress hem, meant to hold scraps. Junie whispered, "I put it there." Ezekiel's breath came out slow. "You smart," he murmured, equal parts impressed and furious at the world for forcing a child to be smart about survival. Junie's voice trembled. "Can you untie me?" Ezekiel glanced around quickly. "Not here," he whispered. "Too many eyes." He guided her behind the boat into a narrow shadowed space between hull and dock pilings. He pulled a small blade from his boot, quick, controlled, and cut the cord on her wrists. Junie gasped as blood rushed back to her hands stinging. Ezekiel murmured, "Give it!" Junie reached into the pouch at her waist with shaking fingers. She pulled out something small and round, an apple core, hollowed, sealed with red wax. Ezekiel stared like he was looking at dynamite. Junie whispered, "It was in my hand." Then it was gone. Then I felt it again later. She frowned, remembering. Like it moved. Ezekiel's face tightened. They took it, opened it, emptied it, he murmured. Then planted it on somebody else. Junie's stomach twisted. "Silas," she whispered, remembering the hangman's face. "I told him." Ezekiel's eyes flicked up, sharp. "You told the hangman?" Junie nodded, trembling. "He had it. I felt it in his pocket." Ezekiel exhaled like a man trying not to swear in front of a child. "Then he run," he murmured. "And now they huntin' everybody." Junie's eyes filled. "We gotta save Mama," she whispered. Ezekiel's gaze softened, but his voice stayed firm. "We gotta keep you alive first," he said. "Alive means we can bargain. Dead means they win." Junie's face crumpled. "I don't want Mama hurt," she whispered. Ezekiel leaned close, voice steady. "Listen," he said. "You defied them once. You gon' do it again." Junie stared, breathing hard. Ezekiel tucked the apple core inside his shirt carefully, like it was a holy thing, and a curse at the same time. Then he took Junie's small hand and guided her toward a waiting boat. "Get in," he murmured. Junie hesitated. "Mama!" Ezekiel's jaw clenched. "I got men," he whispered. "We got eyes. We gon' try. But you." He crouched, level with her. "You are the proof they can't erase. You understand?" Junie swallowed, nodding slowly, though her heart screamed no. Ezekiel lifted her into the boat. Junie curled under a tarp, shaking. And then she heard the docks erupt. Shouts. Boots. A deputy's voice. "Close now. Search every boat!" Junie's body went cold. Ezekiel moved fast, covering her, stepping away as if he was just a man doing dock work. A deputy approached, pistol out, eyes scanning. "Ezekiel!" The deputy snapped. "You see a little girl run through here?" Ezekiel's face stayed blank. "Plenty of little girls in town," he said calmly. The deputy's eyes narrowed. "This one's worth money." Ezekiel's jaw tightened slightly. "Worth money," he repeated, voice neutral, like he was tasting the truth of it. The deputy stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't get righteous with me. The judge wants her found." Ezekiel shrugged. "Then the judge can come look. The deputy's eyes flashed. "Careful," he warned. Ezekiel smiled faintly. "Careful been my whole life," he said softly. The deputy hesitated, then moved on, barking orders. Junie lay under the tarp, heart pounding so loud she thought it would give her away. And then, through the chaos, she heard a familiar rough voice cut across the dock. "Where is the boatman?" Silas Crow shouted. Junie's breath caught. Silas pushed through men like a storm, coat flapping, eyes wild. Behind him, Mr. Finch stumbled, clutching something inside his shirt. Silas spotted Ezekiel and moved toward him quickly. Ezekiel didn't flinch. He watched Silas like he watched the tide, careful, assessing. Silas demanded, "You got her!" Ezekiel's gaze didn't change. "Maybe," he said coolly. Silas's jaw clenched. "They're coming," he snapped. "Sheriff's got half the town hunting. And I got something they want worse than the girl." Mr. Finch stepped forward, voice shaking. "Ezekiel," he whispered. "Please." Ezekiel's eyes flicked to Finch, sharp with anger. "You the one put trouble in an apple?" he murmured. Finch flinched. "I was trying to stop trouble," he whispered. Ezekiel's expression hardened. "Trouble don't stop," he said softly. "It just change hands." Silas cut in, urgent. "We can argue later," he growled. "If we don't move now, we're all dead." Ezekiel's gaze tightened, thinking fast. Then he did something Junie would remember forever. He nodded once. "Push off," he murmured. The boat rocked. Junie's eyes widened under the tarp. Ezekiel stepped into the boat, grabbed a pole and shoved them away from the dock pilings as if he was moving any old cargo. Silas jumped aboard without hesitation. Finch followed, nearly tripping. The boat slid into the river's dark water. On the docks, a deputy shouted, "Stop that boat!" A gunshot cracked. Junie flinched under the tarp. Ezekiel didn't look back. He pushed harder, muscles straining, guiding them toward the marsh-lined channel where bigger boats couldn't easily follow. Silas crouched low, panting, eyes scanning the shore. Finch clutched his chest like he was holding his heart inside. Junie finally wriggled out from under the tarp, eyes huge. Silas saw her and froze for a heartbeat. "You," he breathed. Junie stared at him. "You chose," she whispered, remembering his words at the gallows. Silas's throat worked. He nodded, voice rough. "Looks like you did too," he murmured. Junie swallowed hard. "Mama," she said, voice trembling. "We gotta get Mama." Silas's eyes darkened. "I know," he said quietly, "and that's why we're not done." Finch whispered, "We have the paper." Ezekiel's head snapped toward him. "You got it?" he murmured. Finch nodded shakily. "And she has the core." Ezekiel's gaze fell to Junie, respect and fury mixing. "7 years old," he murmured. "And they tried to bury the truth in your mouth." Junie frowned. "I didn't eat it," she said stubbornly. "I kept it." Silas's eyes burned. "That's why you're still breathing," he said softly. The boat glided deeper into the marsh, reeds whispering, water slapping softly, the town's shouts fading behind them. For a brief moment, Junie let herself believe they might escape. Then Ezekiel said, voice low and heavy, "We got 2 choices." Silas snapped, "No choices, we go back." Ezekiel stared. "Back where the judge owns the law." Silas's jaw clenched. "Back where a child's mama is in chains," he growled. "Back where they'll hang the girl again tomorrow if they catch her. Back where this paper won't matter if nobody lives long enough to show it." Finch whispered, "They'll kill us." Silas's eyes flashed. "Then we make it hurt," he snapped. "We make it loud. We make it so they can't pretend it was about an apple." Junie watched Silas, heart pounding. She didn't fully understand revenge. She understood hunger, fear, her mama's hands. But she understood this. Grown men with ropes and seals and guns had tried to turn her into a warning. And somehow, because she refused to cry, because she refused to name names, because she refused to swallow their trouble, she had turned them into the ones running. Junie's small voice cut through the boat's tense silence. "Miss Clarissa," she said softly, remembering the name she'd shouted at the gallows. "The judge's wife." Finch flinched. Clarissa Caldwell, he murmured. She started this. Silas's eyes narrowed. Why? He demanded. Finch swallowed. Because she knows, he whispered. She knows what her husband is. She knows what he did. And she's tired of cleaning blood with lace. Ezekiel snorted softly. Tired, but still sitting in the big house, he murmured. Finch's voice cracked. She tried to help, he insisted. She hid the proof because she couldn't speak it out loud. Silas's gaze sharpened. Then we make her speak, he said flatly. We put her in a place where silence costs her more than truth. Ezekiel stared. You talking about blackmail, he murmured. Silas's eyes stayed hard. I'm talking about leverage, he said. Junie's stomach twisted. Will it save Mama? She whispered. Silas looked at her, and for the first time his face softened with something like gentleness. It might, he said honestly, but only if we're smart. Only if we don't let them turn you into a corpse they can point at and say, see? Don't steal. Junie's small hands clenched. I didn't steal, she repeated, stubborn as a nail. Silas nodded once. I know, he said. That's why we're going to tell the whole town what you really took. Finch whispered. Truth. Ezekiel murmured. And they gon' try to kill you for it. Silas's jaw tightened. Let them try, he said, voice like iron. This time, we won't be standing alone under their gallows. Junie stared out at the marsh water, dark and endless. And she thought of the square, the rope, the judge's eyes. She thought of her mama's warning. Some folks hide trouble in pretty things. Junie had taken the apple because she was told to, but she'd kept the core because something in her, something stubborn and bright, refused to let grown folks decide what she was allowed to survive. Now the core wasn't just fruit. It was a key, a weapon, and the smallest hands in the boat had been the ones to carry it. That night they didn't go far. They tucked the boat into a hidden channel where reeds rose tall and thick, concealing them like curtains. Ezekiel lit no lantern. Finch spoke only in whispers. Silas sat with his back against the boat's side, staring into darkness as if he could see the courthouse through miles of marsh. Junie curled against a coil of rope, arms wrapped around her knees, trying not to shiver. Silas finally spoke, voice low. Tell me everything, he said to Junie. From the start, Junie swallowed. She didn't like talking. Talking had gotten her sentenced, but Silas wasn't asking like the judge had asked. Silas was listening like the truth might matter. So Junie told him, in broken child sentences, in fragments and images. She told him about Mrs. Porterfield's strange stare, about the man with ink fingers, about the apple seller's warning not to eat the core. She told him about the sheriff's smile and the judge's seal. She told him about how the apple fell and rolled and somehow came back different. Silas's face tightened with each word. When she finished, Silas turned to Finch. Mrs. Porterfield, he said. Why did she do it? Finch's voice was hollow. Because she's scared, he whispered. Because she wants to look clean while standing in filth. Because she thought handing the package to a slave child would keep her hands from getting stained. Ezekiel murmured bitter. Her hands already stained? Finch flinched. I know, he whispered. Silas's jaw clenched. And Judge Caldwell, he said, eyes burning. He recognized the song she hummed. He recognized her. Finch's eyes widened. What? Silas's gaze sharpened. That judge looked at that child like he was looking at a ghost, Silas said. Like he saw himself in her face. The boat went quiet. Junie's stomach flipped. Finch whispered, No. Ezekiel's voice dropped, heavy. You saying what I think you saying? Silas didn't look away from Junie. Who's her father? He asked softly. Junie stared back, confused and terrified. I don't know, she whispered. Mama don't talk about it. Silas exhaled slowly. Then the judge does, he murmured. And that's why he wants her dead. Finch's face twisted. Dear God, he whispered. That would make her evidence. Ezekiel finished, voice cold. Junie's eyes filled. "Mama," she whispered again, voice cracking. "Mama knows." Ezekiel's face softened. "Your mama been knowing things longer than you been alive," he murmured gently. "That's why she told you to keep quiet." Silas's hands clenched. "Then we don't just have proof of kidnapping," he said, voice tight. "We have proof of hypocrisy, of a judge preaching law while breaking it in the dark." Finch swallowed. "If the town hears that," Ezekiel cut in, flat. "Town won't care about hypocrisy," he said. "Town care about power. Town care about money. Town care about fear." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Then we aim the proof where it hurts," he said. Finch whispered, "The newspapers?" Silas nodded slowly. "And the docks," he said. "And the merchants. And the church. We make it so anyone who trades with Caldwell's Circle knows they're trading with kidnappers." Ezekiel stared. "You think shame will stop them?" he asked, skeptical. Silas's gaze turned hard. "Not shame," he said. "Risk. Men like Caldwell stop when the cost gets too high." Junie listened, heart pounding. She didn't understand newspapers. She barely understood judges. But she understood cost. She understood that when you broke a mistress's dress, you paid. When you spilled sugar, you paid. When you spoke out of turn, you paid. Now the judge was going to pay. Junie's small voice cut in, trembling but fierce. "I want Mama," she said. Silas looked at her. Ezekiel looked at her. Finch looked like he might cry. Junie's chin lifted, stubborn. "I don't care about their papers if Mama don't come back." Silas's throat worked. "You're right," he said quietly. "We get your Mama." Ezekiel sighed, long and heavy. "That's the hardest part," he murmured. Silas's eyes burned. "Then we do the hardest part," he said. Finch whispered. "How?" Silas leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. "We use Clarissa Caldwell," he said. Finch flinched. "She'll never—" Silas cut him off. "She already did," he said. "She already tried to help. Now she finishes it or she gets dragged down with him." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. "You gon' threaten a white judge's wife?" Silas's gaze stayed cold. "I'm going to tell her the truth," he said. "Her husband sentenced his own blood to die for an apple." Junie's breath caught. Finch whispered, horrified, "You can't prove that." Silas looked at Junie. "Maybe I can," he murmured. "Because the child knows a song the judge knows." Junie blinked. "The song?" Silas nodded slowly. "The tune you hum," he said gently. "Where'd your mama learn it?" Junie hesitated. "She said—" "She heard it once in the big house," she whispered. "Long time ago, when she was young." Silas's eyes tightened. "From who?" he asked. Junie swallowed. "From the judge," she whispered, like the words tasted wrong. "He came to visit. Mama said he sang when he was drunk." The boat went dead silent. Ezekiel's jaw clenched. Finch whispered, "Oh no." Silas exhaled slowly. "Then Clarissa Caldwell is going to hear that song," he said. "And she's going to understand." Junie's hands clenched. "Will she help Mama?" she whispered. Silas's gaze softened slightly, but his honesty stayed. "She'll help herself first," he said quietly. "But if saving herself means saving your mama, we'll take that bargain." Junie's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "Okay," she whispered. Silas nodded once. "Then we move before dawn," he said. Ezekiel muttered, "Lord, keep us." Finch whispered, "And if they catch us—" Silas's eyes hardened. "Then at least," he said, "they'll never be able to say it was only an apple again." Junie lay back against the rope coil, staring up at the night sky that looked indifferent and endless. She thought of the gallows, new wood, fresh rope, hungry eyes. She thought of how the sheriff had leaned close and said she should have eaten it. Junie's small hand moved to her belly instinctively, as if checking that she was still herself. She whispered into the dark, not quite a prayer, not quite a promise. "I didn't eat it." And somewhere in the marsh, the water moved quietly, carrying their boat toward morning like a secret that refused to stay buried. Before dawn, the marsh stopped feeling like a hiding place and started feeling like a throat. The sky was still bruised dark, but the air had shifted. Cooler, thinner, like it knew something was about to happen. Ezekiel guided the boat through reeds tall enough to swallow a man upright. The water lapped quiet against the hull, pretending innocence. Junie sat between Silas and Finch, wrapped in a rough blanket that smelled like salt and old rope. Her hands were free now, but she kept them clenched anyway, as if she could hold herself together by force. No one spoke much, not because they had nothing to say, because every word felt like it might summon the wrong ears. Ezekiel finally eased the boat into a narrow inlet behind town, where an abandoned fish house leaned crooked toward the river. The boards were gray and splintered, the kind of building people forgot because it wasn't worth stealing. "That's our door," Ezekiel murmured. Silas peered through slats toward town. Lights glowed weak in a few windows. Somewhere a bell tolled once, slow and heavy. "They'll hang her again," Finch whispered, voice tight. "They'll call it a second attempt at justice." Silas's jaw clenched. "Not if she's not there." Junie's small voice cut through, steady in a way that didn't match her age. "I ain't going back to that rope," she said. Silas looked down at her, and something in his expression softened, then hardened right after, like gentleness was too dangerous to hold for long. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "You just have to stay alive long enough for them to regret building it." Ezekiel stepped out first, boots sinking into mud, and helped Junie onto the bank. Finch followed, clutching his shirt where the paper was hidden, like it was his last heartbeat. Silas went last, scanning the darkness, listening. From here, town was a cluster of sleeping threats. And somewhere in it, Junie's mother was locked behind stone and iron, paying for secrets she'd never been allowed to speak. Ezekiel led them along the backside of town, where the streets weren't paved and the houses were smaller. The air smelled of ash and damp wood. A dog barked once, then quieted, like it recognized trouble and didn't want it. They stopped behind a low wall that bordered a yard with a narrow garden. Beyond it, a house stood taller than the rest. 2 stories, neat shutters, a porch that looked like it had never known hunger. Finch swallowed hard. "That's the Caldwell house," he whispered. "Clarissa's awake early. She always is." Silas's eyes narrowed. "You know that how?" Finch didn't meet his gaze. "Because I've been bringing her letters," he murmured. "Because she's been paying me to copy things her husband never wanted copied." Ezekiel exhaled through his nose, bitter. "White folks keep secrets like they keep silver, locked up and polished." Silas crouched. "We don't have time for poetry," he said. Then he looked at Junie. "Can you do it?" Junie's throat tightened. "The song?" she whispered. Silas nodded once. "The tune you hum. The one your mama learned." Junie's hands clenched. "What if she don't care?" she whispered. Finch's voice cracked. "She cares," he insisted too quickly, as if he was begging himself to believe it. She's terrified." Silas's gaze stayed on Junie. "You don't need her kindness," he said. "You need her fear to point the right direction." Junie swallowed. She nodded. They moved. Ezekiel boosted Junie gently over the wall and followed right behind, light-footed for a man his size. Finch climbed awkwardly, nearly catching his coat. Silas came last, silent as a shadow that had learned how to survive. They crossed the yard, stepping between garden rows. Winter had left the soil bare except for stubborn greens. The porch steps creaked once, and all 4 of them froze, breath held. Then the door opened. Clarissa Caldwell stepped out as if the house had exhaled her. She wore a pale shawl over a dark dress, hair pinned back tight. She held a lantern, but she didn't lift it high, like she didn't want to see too much of the world at once. She walked toward the garden, kneeling by a rose bush that shouldn't have been alive this time of year. She touched the stem gently, then paused, her head tilted. Not toward Finch, not toward Silas, toward Junie. As if something in the air had shifted when the child stepped into her yard. Clarissa's voice came out soft, cautious. "Who's there?" Finch started to speak. Silas stopped him with a hand. Junie took one small step forward, and she hummed. It was a simple tune. 3 notes, then a fall, then a slow rise again. It wasn't grand, it wasn't pretty, but it wasn't ordinary either. It was the kind of tune that stuck to the back of your throat and came out when you were scared. The kind of tune your body remembered even if your mind tried not to. Clarissa froze mid-breath. The lantern in her hand trembled. She stood slowly, like she was afraid fast movement might break whatever fragile thing had just formed. Her eyes fixed on Junie's face, and the lantern light caught her features. Small nose, dark eyes, a stubborn set to her mouth that looked too much like someone else's. Clarissa's lips parted. "No," she whispered. Junie stopped humming. Silas stepped into the lantern's reach. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, voice low, "your husband tried to hang this child." Clarissa flinched, as if the word hang had slapped her. "That's impossible," she breathed, but her face said she already knew it wasn't. Finch stepped forward, hands shaking. "Clarissa," he whispered. "They found out about the apple." Clarissa's eyes snapped to Finch. Anger, fear, betrayal, all at once. "You brought her here?" she hissed. "Are you trying to kill us all?" Silas cut in, hard. "They already tried," he said. "We're here because your husband's seal was on the wax, and the sheriff planted the core in my pocket." Clarissa's eyes widened at that. Silas lifted his chin slightly. "I was the hangman." Clarissa stared at him, horrified. Junie's small voice entered, quiet but sharp. "I told you," she said to Silas. "You chose." Clarissa's gaze snapped back to Junie like the child's words were a hook in her ribs. Junie stepped closer, looking up at Clarissa with a steadiness that made the lantern's tremble feel like weakness. "I know you," Junie said simply. Clarissa's throat moved. "You don't," she whispered, but her voice broke on the lie. Junie tilted her head. "You smell like soap," she said, "like the kind Miss Porterfield used. And your hands, you got ink in the lines." Clarissa looked down at her own hands as if she'd forgotten she had them. Finch swallowed and pulled the rolled paper from his shirt, holding it like it might burn him. "This is what she was carrying," he said, voice shaking. "Your proof, your list, your husband's seal." Clarissa didn't reach for it. She stared at it with the expression of someone looking at a coffin. "And you thought," she whispered to Finch, "that putting it in an apple made it harmless." Finch flinched. You thought like a man," Clarissa snapped, then immediately softened as if the anger had nowhere safe to land. Her eyes returned to Junie. Clarissa crouched slowly, bringing her face level with the child's. Junie didn't flinch. Clarissa studied her. Eyes, cheekbones, the stubborn mouth. Then Clarissa whispered, voice barely there, "What's your mother's name?" Junie's throat tightened. "Hester," she said. Clarissa's face went paper white. Silas saw it. The moment denial finally shattered. Clarissa's eyes filled, but she didn't let tears fall. She held them, like she held everything else, tightly, with pain tucked under manners. "Hester," she repeated, voice hollow. "He told me she died." Junie frowned. "My mama ain't dead," she said, fierce, "but you gotta help. They got her." Clarissa's breath hitched. Finch rushed in desperate. "Clarissa, listen. Judge Caldwell recognized her. He looked at her like a ghost," Silas finished. Clarissa's eyes squeezed shut for a heartbeat. When she opened them again, something had changed. Not kindness, decision. She stood, straightening her shawl as if she was armoring herself. "Where is Hester being held?" she asked. Silas answered immediately. "Courthouse basement. Sheriff's cage." Clarissa nodded once. "And the execution?" she said, voice flat. "They'll try again." Finch whispered, "At noon." Clarissa's jaw tightened. "Then we have ours," she said. Ezekiel stepped forward, voice low and steady. "Ours don't mean much when the law belonged to him." Clarissa's gaze flicked to Ezekiel, sharp, assessing, then softened by the smallest fraction. "No," she murmured. The law belongs to whoever the town believes. My husband knows that. That's why he's killing a child in public." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Then we change what they believe," he said. Clarissa's gaze turned cold. "Belief is slow," she said. "We need leverage that moves faster." Junie whispered, "Mama." Clarissa looked down at Junie. Then she said something that made Finch go still. "We take Hester out," Clarissa said. "And we take my husband's reputation with her." Finch swallowed. Clarissa's eyes flashed. "He sentenced a child," she hissed. "He signed names into a list like they were cattle, and he lied to me for years while he prayed in public." Silas held her gaze. "You're going to help?" Clarissa's laugh was small and bitter. "I'm going to survive," she said. "And right now, survival looks like ending him before he ends all of us." Junie stared up at Clarissa, heart pounding. "Can you get Mama?" she whispered. Clarissa crouched again, and for the first time, her voice softened. Not sweet, not performative, just human. "I can get her out of the basement," she said. "But you must do exactly what I say. Do you understand?" Junie nodded hard. Clarissa took a breath, stood, and turned toward her house. "Come," she said, sharp. "Quietly. And if anyone asks, this child is mine." Finch blinked. "What?" Clarissa didn't look back. "If you want Hester alive," she snapped, "you will let the town think I have a reason to protect this girl." Silas's stomach tightened. They already assume everything," Clarissa cut in. "Let them assume something useful." Junie swallowed. The idea of being claimed by a judge's wife felt like stepping into another trap. But Junie knew what traps felt like, and she also knew what doors felt like when they opened. They slipped into Clarissa's house through the back, moving fast and silent. The kitchen was spotless in the way of homes where other people did the scrubbing. Clarissa didn't light more lamps. She led them into a small room off the hallway, part sewing room, part study. Papers sat stacked neatly, ink bottles arranged like soldiers. Clarissa went straight to a cabinet, unlocked it with a key hanging around her neck, and pulled out a folded document. Silas leaned in cautious. Clarissa shook it open. Manumission papers. Finch inhaled sharply. "Clarissa!" Clarissa's eyes stayed hard. "My husband keeps blank forms," she said. "He likes pretending paperwork can make him God." Ezekiel's gaze sharpened. "You forged those?" Clarissa's mouth twisted. "I completed them," she said. "There's a difference." Junie didn't understand the words, but she understood the importance in Clarissa's tone. Clarissa took her pen, dipped it, and began writing with quick, decisive strokes. Silas watched her hand. Steady, practiced. Then Clarissa did something that made Finch's face crumple. She signed Orville Caldwell. Not her own name. His. Finch whispered, "If he finds out—" Clarissa looked up, eyes like steel. "If he finds out," she said, "I'll be dead anyway. The only question is whether I die as his accomplice or his enemy." She stamped the page with a red seal. The same seal. Junie's stomach twisted at the sight of that red imprint. Clarissa folded the paper and pressed it into Silas's hand. "This gets you past a deputy who can read," she murmured, "and it scares one who can't." Silas stared at it. "This frees Hester?" Clarissa's jaw tightened. "On paper," she said. "Freedom on paper is often a lie, but a lie can still be a weapon." Junie's heart hammered. "Can Mama leave?" she whispered. Clarissa's gaze softened again, barely. "If we get her out alive," she said. Then Clarissa turned to Finch. "Where's the list?" she demanded. Finch held up the rolled paper. "Here." Clarissa snatched it, unrolled it, scanned with fast eyes, and went still. Her face drained. Silas watched her expression change from anger to something like grief. "Names," she whispered. "So many." Ezekiel leaned in, eyes narrowing. "That list ain't just ink," he murmured. "That's people." Clarissa swallowed hard. "My husband's signature," she whispered. "His seal. Dates. Ports." Finch's voice broke. "Charleston. Savannah. Mobile." Clarissa's fingers trembled. She rolled it back up and shoved it into her bodice like she couldn't bear to look anymore. Then she turned to them with a calm that felt unnatural. "This is what we do," she said. "Silas, you go to the courthouse as the hangman. You belong there. You move without questions." Silas nodded once. "Ezekiel," Clarissa continued, gaze steady, "you stay out of sight, but close. You'll be our exit." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "You ain't my commander," he murmured. Clarissa met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said quietly, "but that child is your people, and her mother is your people. Help me or watch them die." Ezekiel stared a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow. Clarissa's eyes flicked to Finch. "You will go to the print shop," she said. "Mr. Leary's. You will have the presses ready." Finch swallowed. "He'll be afraid." Clarissa's mouth twisted. "Everyone is afraid," she said. "Tell him the judge's seal is on this list. Fear changes sides when it touches money and reputation." Finch nodded shakily. Clarissa turned to Junie. Junie held her breath. Clarissa crouched again, face level with Junie's, voice dropping low. "You will come with me," she said. "You will be quiet until I tell you to speak. And when I tell you, when I nod, you will hum that tune again. Understand?" Junie swallowed. "Why?" Clarissa's eyes glinted with something sharp and sad. "Because," she whispered, "my husband has built his life on people staying silent. Today we use the one sound he can't pretend he doesn't recognize." Junie's throat tightened. She nodded. Clarissa stood, straightened her shawl, and her face became something the town would believe. A judge's wife. Composed, respectable, untouchable. Then she opened the front door. "Time," she said. The courthouse smelled like old paper and newer fear. Silas walked in first, shoulders squared, rope bag slung over one arm like he was carrying tools, not death. Deputies nodded at him with uneasy respect. Even men who loved violence didn't like looking too long at the person who delivered it. Clarissa followed, Junie at her side, small hand tucked into Clarissa's gloved one. People stared. A judge's wife bringing a slave child into the courthouse at dawn wasn't normal, which meant it was either scandal or command. In a town like this, those were sometimes the same thing. Clarissa didn't glance around. She moved straight toward the stairwell that led down. A deputy stepped into her path, confused. "Mrs. Caldwell." Clarissa's gaze flicked to him like a blade. "Move," she said simply. The deputy hesitated. Clarissa leaned in slightly, voice dropping into something that sounded like private intimacy. "If you block me," she murmured, "you'll be explaining to the judge why you delayed me when I came to correct the record." The deputy's face tightened. He stepped aside. Silas followed, eyes scanning. Junie felt the air change as they descended. The basement was colder, darker. The stone walls sweated damp. A barred door stood ahead. Behind it, someone coughed, a rough, exhausted sound that made Junie's stomach flip. "Mama," Junie whispered before she could stop herself. Clarissa's grip tightened gently, warning. A deputy sat at a small desk near the cell, boots propped up, half asleep. He looked up, saw Clarissa, and jolted. "Mrs. Caldwell," he stammered, standing. Clarissa didn't smile. "Open it," she said. The deputy blinked. "Ma'am, Sheriff said—" Clarissa's voice cut sharp. "The sheriff obeys my husband," she said, "and my husband obeys the law he pretends to represent. Open it." The deputy hesitated, torn between fear of the sheriff and fear of the judge's wife standing in the basement like she owned the air. Silas stepped forward, holding up the folded manumission paper. "This is court business," Silas said, voice rough, confident, the tone of a man who didn't ask permission. The deputy squinted at the seal. The red imprint did its work. His face drained. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered, and fumbled with keys. The lock clicked. The barred door creaked open. Junie surged forward and froze. Hester stood inside, wrists bound, cheek bruised, hair loose, eyes blazing with a fury that hadn't been extinguished by a night in a cage. Her gaze locked on Junie, and for a heartbeat the fury cracked, revealing terror beneath. "Junie," Hester breathed. Junie ran into her mother's arms so hard it nearly knocked Hester backward. Hester clutched her child, shaking, as if she'd been holding her breath since yesterday, and only now remembered how to breathe. Clarissa watched, jaw tight. Silas's throat worked like he was swallowing something bitter. Hester lifted her head, eyes locking on Clarissa. "What is this?" Hester demanded, voice raw. "What game you playing now?" Clarissa didn't flinch. "Not a game," she said quietly. "A correction." Hester's eyes narrowed. "Your husband," Clarissa's voice sharpened. "My husband will not touch your child again," she said. "Not if I can help it." Hester laughed once, harsh. "And why would you help?" she snapped. "You sat in that courtroom and watched him sentence her." Clarissa's face tightened, shame flashing like heat. "Yes," she whispered. "I did." Junie clung to Hester's dress, heart pounding. Clarissa's eyes flicked down to Junie, then back up to Hester. "I watched," Clarissa said, voice low, "because I thought if I moved too soon, he would kill you both faster." Hester's gaze burned. "He already tried." Clarissa nodded once, stiff. "And now," she said, "I am done pretending silence is safety." Hester stared, breathing hard. Then footsteps pounded from above. Fast, angry. A voice echoed down the stairwell like a curse. "What is this?" Sheriff Price. Clarissa's spine straightened. Silas moved instinctively between Clarissa and the stairs, rope bag still on his arm like a shield no one wanted to test. Junie felt Hester's body go rigid. Sheriff Price appeared at the bottom of the stairs, face red with rage, hand on his pistol. His eyes snapped to the open cell, then to Junie in Hester's arms, then to Clarissa. His smile tried to form and failed. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, voice tight, "you shouldn't be down here." Clarissa's gaze stayed cold. "And you shouldn't have locked a woman in a cage," she replied. Sheriff Price's nostrils flared. "By order of the court," Clarissa cut him off. "By order of my husband," she said, "who I will be speaking to immediately." Sheriff Price's smile returned, thin. "Judge Caldwell is occupied." Clarissa stepped forward, close enough that Sheriff Price had to look up slightly, and her voice dropped into something that sounded polite to anyone listening from far away. "I have the list," she murmured. Sheriff Price froze. The change in him was instant, like someone had cut a string inside him. His eyes flicked, quick, toward Silas, toward Junie, toward Hester, then back to Clarissa. "Ma'am," he whispered, and there it was. Fear. Clarissa tilted her head. "You will let this woman leave," she said softly. "Now?" Sheriff Price's jaw clenched. "You don't understand." Clarissa's eyes flashed. "I understand," she hissed, and for a moment the composure cracked enough to show what lived beneath it. "I understand you plan to hang a child at noon and call it law. I understand you planted evidence on the hangman. I understand you have been stealing people and selling them like you were God." Sheriff Price's face went hard again, trying to regain control. "You speak carefully," he snarled. "That's treasonous talk." Clarissa smiled then, small, sharp. "So is kidnapping," she said. Sheriff Price's gaze flicked to the deputy at the desk. The deputy swallowed, eyes darting. Sheriff Price's voice dropped into a dangerous calm. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "you're standing in a basement with a slave woman and a runaway child and a hangman who refuses his duty. You think the town will believe you over me?" Clarissa didn't blink. "I don't need the town," she whispered. "I need your survival instinct." Sheriff Price's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" Clarissa's voice turned crisp. "Hester released," she said. "Junie's sentence vacated. And you," her gaze sharpened, "you will stand down at noon." Sheriff Price's lips curled. "And if I don't?" Clarissa leaned closer, and her voice became a whisper that somehow filled the entire basement. Then, she said, I will hum her song in the square. Sheriff Price blinked, confused. Clarissa's eyes glittered. You know the tune, she said softly. So does my husband. And when the town hears a slave child humming a tune the judge sang in private, people will start asking questions. No gallows can shut up. Sheriff Price's face tightened. He glanced at Junie, and something ugly flickered there. Recognition of a threat he hadn't considered. Junie stared back, small and unblinking. Sheriff Price swallowed. You're making a mistake, he hissed. Clarissa's smile vanished. No, she whispered. I'm making a decision. For a long heartbeat, the only sound was water dripping somewhere in the stone. Then Sheriff Price exhaled sharply, like a man forcing himself not to explode. Fine, he snapped. Take the woman, take the girl, but the judge... Clarissa cut him off. I will handle my husband, she said. Sheriff Price's eyes burned. You can't, he whispered. Clarissa's gaze stayed steady. Watch me. Sheriff Price took a step back, jaw clenched, and barked at the deputy. Get their papers! Make it official! The deputy fumbled, terrified. Hester stared at Clarissa like she was trying to decide whether this was rescue or another trap with softer hands. Silas leaned in toward Clarissa, voice low. We can't trust him, he murmured. Clarissa's eyes stayed on Sheriff Price. I don't, she whispered back. That's why we leave now. Junie clutched Hester tighter. Hester whispered into Junie's hair, voice shaking. Baby, you okay? Junie nodded, hard, fighting tears. I kept it, she whispered. I kept the core. Hester stiffened. Her breath caught. Clarissa's gaze flicked sharply to Junie. What did you say? Clarissa whispered. Junie swallowed. I kept it, she repeated. But it moved. They took it. Clarissa's mouth tightened. I know, she murmured, then straightened as the deputy approached with shaking hands. He held out a paper. Crudely written. Official enough to fool a man who wanted to be fooled. The red seal stamped at the bottom. Clarissa snatched it and turned toward the stairs. Up, she ordered. They moved as one. Clarissa first, Junie and Hester close, Silas behind like a guard. Ezekiel nowhere in sight, but somehow Junie felt him anyway, like a shadow in the walls. They reached the main floor, and then they heard it. A sound that made every muscle in Silas's body tighten. The courthouse doors opening, boots stomping, a familiar voice, calm and cold as polished stone. Where is my wife? Judge Orville Caldwell had arrived early, and he was not alone. 2 men flanked him in dark coats, outsiders, not town deputies. Their eyes were sharp, assessing, not the sheriff's men, something else. Judge Caldwell's gaze swept the hallway, landed on Clarissa, and then slid to Junie. The judge's face didn't change much, but Junie saw the tiny crack anyway, the flicker of recognition, the hunger of control trying not to show. Clarissa stepped forward, posture perfect. Husband, she said, voice steady. Judge Caldwell's eyes didn't leave Junie. Clarissa, he replied quietly. Why is that child here? Clarissa didn't flinch. Because, she said, I am ending this. Judge Caldwell's expression tightened. Ending what? Clarissa reached into her bodice and pulled out the rolled paper, the list. She held it up between them like a knife. Judge Caldwell's eyes narrowed. Sheriff Price appeared behind him, face tense, watching Clarissa like a man watching a fuse burn toward powder. Judge Caldwell's voice remained calm. You don't know what you're holding. Clarissa's smile turned sharp. I know exactly, she said. I know your seal. I know your signature. I know the names of people you stole. Judge Caldwell's gaze flicked to the 2 men beside him. One of them shifted, hand near his coat. Junie's stomach twisted. Silas moved subtly, placing himself closer to Junie and Hester. Judge Caldwell spoke softly, like he was correcting a child. Clarissa, he said, give me that paper. Clarissa shook her head once. No. Judge Caldwell's eyes hardened, and the softness vanished. You forget, he murmured. What happens to women who embarrass their husbands? Hester's body went rigid. Junie felt her mother's fury vibrate. Clarissa's face tightened, but she didn't step back. Instead, she did something that made the entire hallway feel like it had stopped breathing. She turned her head slightly and nodded to Junie. Junie's throat went dry. This was it. Junie looked up at Hester. Hester's eyes were wide, terrified, furious. Then she nodded too, just once. Junie inhaled, and she hummed. 3 notes, then a fall, then a slow rise again. The tune slid into the courthouse hallway like smoke. Judge Caldwell froze. Not just a pause. A full-body stillness, like the song had grabbed him by the throat. The 2 men beside him glanced at each other, confused. Sheriff Price's face went tight with panic. Clarissa's voice cut through loud enough for the deputies, the clerks, the curious people gathering near the doors to hear. "My husband sang that tune," she said, voice shaking with controlled rage. "The night he came home drunk and told me he could do anything he pleased because the law was his." A murmur rippled. Judge Caldwell's eyes flashed, sharp, deadly. "Clarissa!" he hissed. Clarissa stepped closer, holding the list up higher. "And this child," Clarissa continued, voice rising, "was sentenced to die for an apple because you were afraid the town would learn what you really are." Judge Caldwell's jaw clenched. "Enough!" Clarissa's eyes burned. "No," she snapped. "I have been enough, quiet enough, polite enough, blind enough." The hallway filled with people now, clerks, deputies, townsfolk who smelled scandal like blood and water. Judge Caldwell's voice dropped into a dangerous calm. "You will bring this shame into my courthouse," he murmured, "and think you will walk away." Clarissa's voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "I already walked away," she whispered, "the moment you tried to hang a child who looks like you." That sentence hit the air like a thrown stone. The murmurs turned into gasps. Judge Caldwell's face went very still. Sheriff Price's hand moved toward his pistol. Silas's muscles tightened. Hester's breath hitched. Junie stared up at the judge, heart hammering, and realized the truth was finally out loud, whether anyone believed it or not. Judge Caldwell stepped forward, voice like ice. "Who told you that?" he whispered. Clarissa's eyes didn't blink. "The way you looked at her," she said, "like you were staring at your own sin." Judge Caldwell's gaze snapped to Junie, and for the first time, Junie saw something in his eyes that wasn't just power. It was fear, not fear of God, fear of being seen. Judge Caldwell's lips tightened. He spoke, quiet but carrying. "This is hysterics," he said. "My wife is unwell." Clarissa laughed, bitter. "Unwell," she repeated. "Yes, unwell with truth." Judge Caldwell turned slightly to the 2 men beside him. "Remove her," he said calmly, "and take the paper." Everything happened at once. One of the men lunged toward Clarissa. Silas moved fast, blocking him, rope bag swinging into the man's chest. The man stumbled. Sheriff Price drew his pistol. Hester yanked Junie back, shielding her with her body. Clarissa clutched the paper, eyes wild. The hallway erupted into shouts, and above it all, Junie heard Silas's voice, rough, furious, loud enough to cut through panic. "She defied the hangman," Silas shouted, pointing at Junie. "And now she's defying the judge." People froze, because a hangman speaking like that wasn't normal. And in that split second of stunned silence, Clarissa did the one thing Judge Caldwell never expected from a woman raised to be ornamental. She tore the list in half, not destroying it, splitting it. Then she shoved one half into Finch's hands. "Run!" she snapped. Finch's eyes went wide. He turned and bolted down the corridor like his life had finally chosen a direction. Judge Caldwell roared, "Stop him!" Sheriff Price fired, but the shot hit stone, sparks flaring. The crowd screamed. Silas grabbed Clarissa's wrist and yanked her toward the side door. Ezekiel appeared like a shadow made solid, slamming into a deputy and shoving the door open. "Now!" Ezekiel bellowed. Hester clutched Junie and ran. They spilled out into the morning air, into a street already beginning to fill with whispers and movement. Behind them, the courthouse exploded with shouts, boots, orders. Judge Caldwell's voice rang from inside, furious, unraveling. Bring me the child! Junie's heart hammered. Hester ran like the world was on fire. Silas stayed behind them, half guard, half fugitive now. Ezekiel led them down an alley that smelled like damp brick and smoke. Clarissa stumbled, breath ragged, still clutching her half of the list. They turned a corner, and there, at the alley's end, stood Mrs. Evelyn Porterfield in her pale yellow dress, blocking the path like she'd been waiting all along. Her face was pinched, eyes bright with something like panic dressed as pride. Behind her, 2 deputies raised their rifles. Mrs. Porterfield's voice came out trembling but sharp. "There she is," she whispered, staring at Junie. "The little thief." Junie went cold. Hester stopped so suddenly, Junie nearly fell. Silas's hand moved toward his rope bag like it was a weapon. Clarissa's face tightened, recognizing the mistress immediately. Mrs. Porterfield's gaze flicked to Clarissa, and her mouth curled. "So," Mrs. Porterfield murmured, "the judge's wife decided to get her hands dirty." Clarissa's eyes burned. "You used a child," she snapped. "You handed her an apple like it was a leash." Mrs. Porterfield's voice rose, frantic. "I did what I had to," she hissed. "Do you know what your husband would have done to me if he thought I was involved? He would have ruined my family, sold my property, dragged my name through—" Ezekiel snarled. "Your name ain't worth a child's neck." Mrs. Porterfield flinched at his voice, like it offended her to hear fury from someone she didn't consider fully human. Then she steadied herself and lifted her chin. "Give her to me," she said, pointing at Junie, "and I'll tell the sheriff to let the mother go." Hester's laugh was raw, terrifying. "Let me go?" she spat. "You think I'm still begging you for air?" Junie clutched Hester's dress, shaking. Mrs. Porterfield's eyes widened slightly, and Junie saw something there. Guilt, maybe, or fear. But it was drowned by her need to survive. "Don't be foolish," Mrs. Porterfield hissed. "This town will side with the court. Always." Clarissa stepped forward, voice shaking with rage. "Not if the town hears why," she snapped. Mrs. Porterfield smiled, thin. "And who will tell them?" she whispered. "Your little printer friend. He'll be caught before he reaches the press." Clarissa's stomach dropped. Silas's face tightened. "Finch," he breathed. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. "Where's your men?" he muttered, scanning the rooftops. Mrs. Porterfield's gaze sharpened as if she'd read their worry. "Your escape is a story you tell yourselves," she murmured. "But the law is real." Junie's voice came out small and shaking, but it cut through anyway. "You're scared," Junie whispered. Mrs. Porterfield blinked, startled at being addressed by the child she'd tried to sacrifice. Junie's eyes burned. "You're scared 'cause you know what's inside the apple wasn't mine," she said. "You're scared 'cause you know you handed me trouble." Mrs. Porterfield's face tightened. "Silence!" she snapped, but her voice trembled. Junie swallowed, then lifted her chin in the same stubborn way she'd done under the gallows. "I didn't steal," Junie said, louder now. "You gave it to me." The deputies shifted, uneasy. Town men didn't like hearing a child speak like an accusation. Mrs. Porterfield's cheeks flushed. "She's lying," she hissed. "She's been taught to—" Clarissa's voice snapped like a whip. "By who?" she demanded. "By her mother in chains? Or by the judge who sang her lullaby and then tried to hang her?" Mrs. Porterfield flinched, eyes flashing. "That's madness," she whispered, but her gaze darted fast toward the courthouse as if she feared the truth might spill out the windows. Silas stepped forward, voice rough and loud. "I was hired to hang her," he said, "and I refused." Mrs. Porterfield's eyes widened. "You'll die for that," she whispered. Silas's mouth curled, bitter. "Maybe," he said, "but not before I make sure everyone knows what kind of men you've been kneeling to." Ezekiel shifted, preparing, like a storm about to break. And then, far down the street, came a new sound. Not boots, not shouting. The rhythmic clatter of a press lever. Once, twice, a bell-like thump. Clarissa's head snapped toward it. Mrs. Porterfield's face drained, because Mr. Leary's print shop was only 3 streets away. And somebody, somehow, had reached it. Finch. Mrs. Porterfield's voice went thin. "Stop them!" she hissed to the deputies. The deputies hesitated, because deputies could threaten a slave woman, but deputies didn't like chasing scandal toward a printing press when half the town might be watching. Ezekiel seized the moment. He lunged, not at a deputy's weapon, not in some dramatic fight, but straight into the space, shoving a trash barrel hard so it rolled, clattering, breaking line of sight. Chaos. Hester ran. Clarissa ran. Silas grabbed Junie's hand and pulled. They surged past Mrs. Porterfield. And Mrs. Porterfield did something desperate. She reached out and grabbed Junie's hair. Junie screamed. Silas spun, fury flashing, and yanked Junie free without hesitation. Mrs. Porterfield stumbled, falling to her knees in mud, hands shaking like she'd just touched fire. Junie clung to Silas, sobbing now, unable to hold it in. Silas's voice dropped low, meant only for Mrs. Porterfield. "You built a gallows for a child," he snarled. "Now live with the sound of her screaming in your sleep." Then he ran again. They tore down the street toward the print shop as shouts rose behind them like dogs released. And above the chaos, the courthouse bell began to ring. Not for church, not for justice, for alarm, for power, panicking. For men who'd thought a child was easy to erase, realizing too late that a 7-year-old with an apple core had turned into a match near a powder room. They reached the corner, and the print shop door burst open. Mr. Finch stumbled out, ink smeared on his hands, eyes wild, holding up a fresh page, still damp, still smelling of metal and paper. At the top, in bold black type, a child sentenced to die for an apple. Under it, the words that made the street seem to tilt. Judge Caldwell's seal found in kidnapping list. Finch's voice cracked as he shouted, "Read it! Read it before they burn it!" Town people poured in from side streets, drawn by the ringing bell and the shouted headline like moths toward flame. Faces turned, mouths opened, whispers ignited. Clarissa stepped into the open street, held up her half of the list, and her voice rang clear, shaking but loud. "My husband's seal," she cried. "His signature! And he tried to hang a child to keep it quiet." Judge Caldwell appeared at the far end of the street, pushing through deputies, robe flapping like a dark wing. His face was no longer calm. It was fury stripped bare. His eyes locked on Junie, and Junie, still trembling, still sobbing, did something no one expected from a child who'd already escaped the gallows once. She stepped forward into the open. Hester grabbed for her, terrified. Junie pulled free gently, wiping her face with her sleeve. Then Junie looked straight at Judge Caldwell, and she hummed that tune again. Steady now, louder, letting it carry down the street like a challenge. Judge Caldwell froze mid-step, and the town, watching him stop at the sound of a slave child's song, began to understand something they'd never been meant to understand. This wasn't about an apple. This was about blood and power, and a child who had just defied the hangman twice. Once by escaping the rope, and now by forcing the judge to flinch in public. Judge Caldwell's voice came out strangled. "Stop her!" he snapped. But the street had shifted. People weren't just looking at Junie anymore. They were looking at him, and in a town built on obedience, being looked at like that was the beginning of the end.